Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Day 2 of testing in Bahrain is over, and once again it's Mercedes making the headlines. A decent day 1 for them, but certainly not the case today. Difficulties in testing pretty much from start to finish, a hydraulic failure to close out the day, and rumours circulating they had a massive loss of downforce from the front axle today that they simply don't know why it happened. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Let's dive through testing as of course on day 1 of testing. General optimism around the Mercedes camp. They said yes, their car isn't perfect, there are problems to solve, but generally good problems to solve rather than, with balance and the like that they can fix with setup and certain upgrades rather than the porpoising problems they had last year. So generally, they were relatively happy from day 1. There was some excitement. Toto Wolff said they believe they have a car that has the potential to win this year's World Championship. They did admit, though, even today or before the testing began today, that Red Bull is still by far and away the strongest car and the team to beat this year. They reckoned, Mike Elliott, the Red Bull's something like 4 to 6 tenths faster. That's a mega gap. And I said before the season even began or before testing began, if Mercedes can go into Bahrain 2-3 tenths off the pace of the Red Bull, I think they'll be relatively happy with that given where they were last season. We're talking 7-8 tenths off the pace last season around about this time. So if they're 5 tenths off, that's not really where they want to be, right? If they can be close enough, given the extra development time Red Bull have had with the fact that they've had a great car for a long time, Mercedes had took ages to solve their problems, I think they'll be pretty happy if they're only a couple of tenths off where they need to be. We know Mercedes have got plenty of upgrades in the pipeline. That's been made very clear that this is not their final version of the car. But if they're still 5 tenths off, that's not ideal. And we don't really know where Ferrari are going to be. George Russell did say that, okay, he believes eventually they'll get into the championship fight. But, winning in Bahrain is going to be a bit of a stretch. And that's certainly looking less likely after the events of today. Toto Wolff also mentioned that, yes, the W14 is a better platform than the W13. That's what they believed after day 1, and new components will arrive down the line that will move them in the right direction. However, they've got to solve the serious issues that came up on day 2 of testing. One other team struggling a bit right now is McLaren. I think it's been quite clear by Zach Brown and others that they're not where they want to be. There was also rumours emerging their car is way too draggy in a straight line, which is going to slow them down as well. So they've not been looking good so far. One team that has made some steps today, I think, was Ferrari. Day 1 was about clarifying whether their car matched on track what it was doing in the simulator. He says day 1 they saw exactly what they expected to see, so they could start dialing in setups. Ferrari are going to be fast. Are they going to have the better tyre degradation though? Because last season we saw that it was Red Bull with the great tyre deg, Ferrari not quite as good. Rumours are circulating that Red Bull's tyre deg this year might be even better than it was last year. Ferrari's is still a little bit up in the air whether it's going to be good, and it's only one track, one set of conditions without any really refined setup, so it's early days here to read too much into this practice or this testing, but still there are clearly some takeaways. And I mean the rumours coming out of Red Bull are just unbelievable, honestly. The fact that Red Bull are just able to go on the track and deliver some great laps as they were doing last year, to be honest, immediately with seemingly very little setup, no tyre degradation, incredible long run pace. It's definitely a scary sign for the rest of the grid right now, because Verstappen just went on track on a medium tyre and immediately pumped in a lap 6 tenths faster than anyone else had done. It got beaten at the end of the day, but that was in cooler conditions where the tyres don't overheat so much, with Zhou on a set of C5s in an Alfa, which is the softest compound. Verstappen was on one of the medium compounds, and in a car that obviously has also potentially made some progress in the Alfa Romeo. One other team that's made massive progress potentially is the Aston Martin. The Aston Martin hype train continues right now. More great laps today, a great pace by Alonso. Alonso put in a lap today that was half a second quicker than the fastest Aston Martin managed last year in qualifying. So it goes to show how much progress they've made over the last year. The fact that he was on a medium tyre, a C3, able to do a lap faster than they achieved at all last year in quali is certainly something to talk about. So I'm sure there's a lot of hope around Aston Martin, and some say they'll be challenging Mercedes for being the 3rd, 4th fastest team, and certainly at the front of the midfield. These are where Mercedes issues begin to start though. So earlier in the day in the hot conditions, and this is the thing in circuits like Bahrain, and also the fact that they've got this kind of matte black car. It's not all matte, but if you've got a black car, you would think that it's going to soak up more heat, right? So it's probably going to be hotter than if it was silver. I don't know, just a theory. But maybe that's contributing to some of their difficulties in the heat. Maybe it's tyre related, maybe it's setup related, who knows? But it was quite clear that the car was not really responding in especially some of the slower speed corners. Getting the, understeery, oversteery, it didn't look particularly fun to control, and the car balance that wasn't really there on day 1. They were attempting to dial in on day 2, and it didn't really happen. And Toto Wolff said Red Bull is very fast, Ferrari are quick today as well. The W14 is struggling a bit in the heat, and the car isn't on the level of Red Bull or Ferrari yet. Not exactly a massive surprise, but things then got worse when, after Hamilton pumped in about 70 or so laps at the start of the day, George Russell was out on track only doing 26 laps before then his car failed. It actually says on the steering wheel here, hydraulic failure, which is exactly what occurred. Now, we saw some hydraulic failures last year. I think notably it was Sainz in Baku that had a hydraulic failure at the start of the season, with Red Bull in Bahrain and also Verstappen in Melbourne. I'm not sure it was hydraulic necessarily. It was talked about as a fuel issue, like a fuel pipe issue or whatever it was at the time. But hydraulic failures can happen, but admittedly they are rare, especially for a team like Mercedes. Now, this is kind of what testing is for, and Mercedes would much rather this failure happen now so they can actually resolve it rather than it happen when they're actually in a race weekends, which could still happen to a team like Red Bull. Who knows? Their testing has been impeccable so far, but last year it was pretty much the same story. They turned up to Bahrain, had a double DNF. So, Mercedes, I imagine, will be not exactly, well, they won't be happy to see this at all, but I guess they'll be relatively satisfied that, okay, this is an issue that we didn't realize, and they're obviously planning to solve it. But it did mean that that was it for them on track today, and after this red flag came up with an hour and a half left, by the time they'd got the car back to the garage and got everything sorted, there was no chance for them to return to the track, and that was it for Mercedes running on the day. They covered everything up as well, just to absolutely ensure that no one could see the flaw, no one could see any details of the W14, and whether any team actually wants to copy anything, I guess will remain to be seen, whether this car's any good over time. So Mercedes confirm into the running for today. The hydraulic failure indeed was the reason why George Russell stopped on track, and they're going to try and solve that overnight. But that is not the only reason why we see this incredible image actually of, in the Bahrain paddock, all of the engineers. Well, we see Mike Elliott here on the left. This might be Toto Wolff sitting down. Of course, we've got George Russell, Lewis Hamilton discussing something, and we can see their kind of, not exactly sullen faces, but pretty serious faces on the Mercedes camera right here on the situation they currently find themselves in. This is not just related to the hydraulic issue, but this is the general handling characteristics of their car weren't what they expected today. And Tony Gruner from Amos says the following: apart from the hydraulic issue, Mercedes also suffered from a strange loss of downforce on the front axle. The cause could not be yet identified. Hope is that the night service comes up with an explanation, but Toto Wolff says we're a bit lost as we don't really know where we stand right now. So very interesting stuff. And look, this isn't Mercedes just sandbagging right there. Okay, they forgot to take the sandbags off the front wings, they lost the downforce, but we know full well that Mike Elliott said that they redesigned the entirety of the front suspension this year to aid in certain areas, and for whatever reason they've suffered a massive loss of front downforce today and were struggling to figure out why it happened. And they even go on to say here in the article that there was a sensor on the front wing or whatever on the front axle that had failed, which would have given them helpful data in figuring out why. So to kind of go from bad to worse in Mercedes, right, they've got the hydraulic failure, but also in the heat, or for whatever reason, their car wasn't behaving the way it was on day one, even though on day one they weren't really trying to make it behave well. When they did, then they ran into some issues. So this is an issue for Mercedes, obviously, and it does raise the question because last year they solved the porpoising, but then they had other issues to deal with on last year's car, and they didn't even fully solve the porpoising. This year, they've solved the porpoising, and therefore Russell says, okay, our other issues, if there might be few, and well, there might be some of them, should be easier to solve. Is like, have they just stumbled across another issue with this car concept that they're now going to struggle to resolve? So, it's obviously a difficult day for Toto Wolff and Mercedes, because I'm sure they imagined they would come in here today, make a step from yesterday, and also do a lot of mileage. Their mileage wasn't terrible, right? They got in about 90 or so laps, which is a way behind where the top teams were in terms of numbers on the day, but still not an absolute disaster, but definitely a fair bit of lost running, which would have been very valuable given this loss of downforce that Toto Wolff and co are suggesting was happening. And even these words, right, we feel a bit lost right now. We don't know where we stand either on the downforce generated or just how competitive the car is generally going to be. We know that Red Bull and Ferrari are almost certainly going to be the two fastest cars. Where do Aston Martin come into all this, right? Can they get up there with the Mercedes? Can they be competitive? Can they challenge for P5 on what is probably what Mercedes are going for on the first weekend, to be perfectly honest, the way things look at the moment, especially when you look at the testing data. So congratulations to AlphaTauri for completing 159 laps today. Williams were P2, so they're getting nearly the top there with 154. That was all in the hands of Logan Sargent as well. It's pretty cool stuff just to see. Obviously, his pace isn't going to be crazy so far, but he's learning quick, and doing 154 laps in a day is certainly going to help with that one. Verstappen did less laps today than he did yesterday. Half of that was Sergio Perez in the morning, but Red Bull with about 123. Alpine 108. So Mercedes with 98 aren't exactly miles behind, but losing that running wasn't ideal, and even Hamilton's stint in the morning was far from optimal. So as I've said before, and I'll say it again, the overall numbers here don't really mean too much. Guanyu actually topped the lot though in the Alfa Romeo with a 1:31.6, which is getting down there to the kind of times we saw last year. I believe the fastest time we saw in testing last year was Verstappen with something like a 1:31.9. We're already getting into the 1:31.6 territories on day 2. So, you know, certainly when we get to qualifying next weekends, we're going to see cars get into the 1:29 lows, I imagine. We'll see how it goes. Last year's pole time, I believe, was a 1:30.5 from Charles Leclerc. 1:30.6 was PT for Max Verstappen. So we'll see how quick they get this year. And also tomorrow will be interesting to see if anyone can come close to last year's pole time, which would be quite interesting. But Zhou went out right at the end of the day on a set of C5s, the softest compound, put in a 1:31.6. Certain circuits, like obviously when it's hotter, it can be better because you want to get the tyres up to temperature. But on tracks like Bahrain, when it's hot anyway, the cooler conditions are often better because when the track is cooler, the tyres don't overheat so much during the lap. And that's kind of the conditions where Zhou was in, where he was on the softer compounds in the better conditions and did a lap that was just about P1. But Verstappen did his 1:31.6 quite a while ago on the medium tyres. Like, man, that Red Bull is rapid. But P3 was Fernando Alonso, so 6 or so tenths off Verstappen, but in an Aston Martin. Then Nick de Vries in an Alfa Tauri, Nico Hülkenberg, so it's all over the place. It's testing, right? What do we expect? But Mercedes P13 at P15 on the day, after being round about where they thought they might be on day 1. Certainly not a good day for them at all, and well, a big day 3 for them of testing to figure out what their issues were, and could be a crucial one for the entire context of their season. So very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.